Hi, my name is Freyja Harris. I am the Executive Director of the Coalition for Home Repair, and I will be serving as the moderator of today's panel session. So for those that are serving on our panel, feel free to place yourself on the screen so that everyone can see your faces. And we are going to be having a very engaging conversation. We are all of kindred spirits in terms of really wanting to make sure that we are addressing the needs of communities that are under-resourced in order to preserve affordable home ownership. My organization in particular focuses on working with home repair, volunteer-based organizations, as well as organizations such as Habitat for Humanity and Rebuilding Together, to really work within actually rural settings is where we started, but we are working in all sorts of communities, helping folks to age in place, veterans, persons with disabilities, and just households that we really want to ensure that they have stable communities and housing that they can live in and pass on to their successors, to future generations. So I would like to pass on to the panelists so that they can share a little bit about themselves. I will turn to Trudy.
Good morning. Thanks for having me here today. And I seem to be having an echo, sorry. I am the CEO for a smallish nonprofit in Washington State. We work primarily in the capital region of Olympia. If you don't know where Olympia is, we're about halfway between Seattle and Portland. Our organization has been around for about 33 years. Of course, 33 years ago, we were much more rural than we are today. But we also work in some of our surrounding counties, which are considered officially rural. And we do scattered site affordable rentals. So for all those folks out there who are unable to be homeowners, and there's a lot of folks out there who, for a variety of reasons, are not in a place where they can be a homeowner, we give them the opportunity to live in neighborhoods in their community, to be a part of their community instead of apart from their community, and feel like they are once again worthy to be a citizen because they have a home that they live in and nobody knows what their income is. So we do a lot of scattered site single family homes. Lots of it is shared housing. Probably about 40% of our portfolio is shared housing because for many, many people, they can't even afford an apartment by themselves. And they're not out there for them to be in. So we do shared housing to reduce their costs for housing.
Thank you, Trudy. And now I turn to Shannon.
Hi, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Thank you so much for joining, and thank you to Up for Growth for putting this panel on. I am the principal for policy and advocacy at Community Solutions. We are a national nonprofit that leads a movement called Built for Zero, which is comprised of 107 plus or minus communities in the US that are working to measurably and equitably end homelessness. We work with these communities hand in hand to use data and other evidence-based approaches to prevent inflow into homelessness from happening in the first place, to build and sustain homeless response systems that can actually end rather than just manage homelessness, and also to quickly deliver affordable housing that can close the housing gap. In addition to that direct work with communities, we also work at the policy level to solve some of the key data and governance and collaboration challenges and establish accountability mechanisms at federal, state, and local levels. And so in terms of our specific work in rural communities, we are currently working with 12 continuums of care that are designated as largely rural by HUD. And just in terms of defining terms, a continuum of care is the local planning body that's responsible for coordinating homeless services in a certain geographic area. So we're working with 12 continuums of care to implement the Built for Zero approach. And we also are working very closely with USDA, HUD, and rural communities themselves to identify the policies and interventions that will address the specific challenges that they face. So thank you again, and great to be here with you all.
Thank you, Shannon. And now I turn to Jonathan.
Great. Thank you, Freyja. I'm Jonathan Harwitz. I am Policy Director at the Housing Assistance Council. We're also a national nonprofit that helps build homes and communities across rural America. We're a half-century old, and we, in addition to our policy work, we provide training and technical assistance to community-based organizations. Loans for affordable housing. We have a community development financial institution, and in-depth research on rural community housing and economics, and you'll be seeing quite a bit of that today. For those of you who are familiar with HUD, they have their own policy development and research division that doesn't exist at USDA, and we actually crunch a lot of the data for that, which you will see later in the presentation.
Fantastic. So we have a wealth of expertise, and we were going to go through some questions to kind of get the ball rolling, but also as from those on the call, some questions were shared, and we will try to incorporate those as well. But to get us started, let's ask that really big question. Why is preservation such an important part of the housing supply need in rural communities? So I want to go backwards and start with Jonathan.
Great, thanks, Fran. And Omar, if you can tee up, I promise, tee up the first slide. I promise I'm not going to be powering through a PowerPoint here, but kind of a spoiler alert, rural multifamily preservation. The punchline is rural America is losing housing at an alarming rate. If you can go to the next slide to talk about the context that we're working in, which is an incredible affordability challenge across the nation. And if you can go to the next slide, and we can make these available afterwards. This is a heat map that shows housing cost burden, the percentage of people who are paying more than 30% of their income in rent. I will admit to being old enough to remembering 1980. As you can see here, the top of that scale is about 48%, and you can see almost nowhere in the country are 48% of the population households paying more than 30% in their cost burden. If we can go to the next slide, there's 2020. And so what you can see is housing affordability has skyrocketed, and I think part of the point that we're going to be getting into is that housing affordability was never only an urban problem, but it is without a doubt now a huge rural issue. And from what I would describe as, I would say that's the feeder system to homelessness. Is this affordability burden? And so that's the context. And the last thing I'll say is the reason why preservation is so critical. I've been doing housing policy for over 25 years, and the one policy I've never seen invented is a time machine. You can't get a time machine to go back to when housing was cheaper, you could acquire the land early. And I see Trudy nodding. The reality is the best thing to do to maintain affordable housing is to maintain the housing you already have. So that's why we're talking about preservation.
So I'll turn to Trudy.
Yeah, you couldn't have said it any clearer, Jonathan. And you know, this organization is 33 years old. I've been here for 11 years, and since day one, I have been telling everyone who will listen, housing will be no more cheap than it is today. We need to get it today. And often, you know, what we hear is, oh, but it's so expensive. It's so expensive. It's like, well, yes, it is. And it's not going to get cheaper. And if you want to preserve what you have, you need to get it today. And the longer we put that off, and you know, we've seen this over the last 30 years, right? 30 years ago, our organization began because we saw rural housing disappearing. And we were going out and saying, hey, we need to acquire this housing now to keep it in our community. And there was not a lot of support for that because of the expense of housing. And I think, you know, we often talk about the value of housing, and we also, I think, need to talk about the values behind housing, right? What are our values as a community around housing? Is it really that we need to do housing cheaply for low-income people? Is that all that low-income people deserve? Is a cheap house? I don't think it is. And I think in rural communities, there is availability of housing if we move and buy it, and don't keep saying we need to wait till it's cheaper. And we see that, we see that in grant applications or funding applications where we are asked, oh, so what's it going to cost per unit? And I've been on funding panels where panelists are saying, hey, well, this unit is going to cost $100,000 less than that unit, so we should fund this unit, even if it's a lesser quality, right? They want to fund something that's cheaper. So, totally on board with what you're saying, Jonathan. We need to get the housing now. We can't keep waiting for it to be cheaper. It's not going to happen.
Shannon.
Yeah, I mean, can't add too much to what's already been said, but just to say that, I spoke with some of our rural communities in preparation for this question just to get their sense of why preservation is important. And they brought up two different types of preservation, which I thought was interesting. One was the physical preservation of housing, which is what we've been talking about, which is obviously super important. I think I read something like $5.6 billion is needed over the next 20 years to preserve about 500,000 rental homes in USDA communities. But the other issue that they brought up that I thought was interesting was they also considered preservation. How do we keep affordable housing affordable? So the existing affordable housing stock, when those loans reach maturity, the property owners are no longer required to meet affordability standards, and they can convert their properties to market rate housing or stop operating the property altogether. And so they're estimating that between 2016 and 2027, more than 16,000 rental homes will be lost every year, and which will reduce the stock of affordable housing in rural areas, even as Jonathan and Trudy pointed out, the pressure for affordable housing is increasing. So I would say for me, preservation is the physical preservation, and also how do we keep affordable housing affordable?
Yes, go ahead, Trudy.
I just want to say that that's, a conversation we have a lot at our state level. Our organization receives funding to go out and purchase homes, which is awesome, right? But we can't purchase a home that already has a low income person in it and preserve that. They will only fund us to add new units, which means we have to buy empty homes, right? So literally the person who is in an affordable home has to become homeless before we can help them. And that those kinds of policies are some of the things we need to change as well, which, is supporting what you're saying, Shannon.
I'm very glad you brought that up, Trudy, because one of the things the Coalition for Home Repair does is focusing on homeowners who are currently low income and keeping them in their homes. So their home is already affordable and may actually even already be paid off because at some time in their life, they were able to purchase a home, life happens, incomes change, and now that home is in a state of disrepair. So if the house or if the roof falls in, if the pipes don't work, all the things that make it a home and livable fail to work, that individual could also become homeless, lose that affordable property, and then go into an unaffordable rental market. So in one other solution, in terms of but in addition to purchasing affordable properties that people can either rent or purchase, is keeping those that are already in affordable home ownership, keeping them home owners. And it's a really simple, in the grand scheme of things, fix. If fixing a roof and putting in a new water heater keeps a family with a home that may have been in their family for some time and they can pass that on, that's an asset. And so instead of allowing someone to become homeless, having the funds through the federal and state, CDBG is one of those resources. USDA also provides that, but it is limited. And oftentimes the repairs exceed what a grant could actually manage. And so, yes, these are just some of the mechanisms by which affordable rentals or homeowners can stay in affordable housing. Yes, Jonathan.
Couple things here, just jumping off your last point and then to what Shannon was talking about earlier. First, I always say that when we in the policy world start using program numbers, the conversation is over with the normal people. But I will mention all the numbers in USDA start with 5 for some reason. As you know, the 504 home repair program is a very powerful program. But as you were alluding, replacing a water heater doesn't cost what it did back in the day. And for many of these programs, number one, grant limits haven't been updated even for inflation, and funding, just to give one factoid, CDBG has lost 75% of its value relative to its establishment in 1974. So we're talking about a world of limited resources. And secondly, since Shannon mentioned the 515 program, I think it probably is appropriate for me real quickly to add a little bit to the trends that Shannon was mentioning, which frankly, it's even worse than you said, Shannon. The most recent data. So Omar, if you could just pull up the next slide. I can power through these quickly because I think the conversation is the most important thing. The 5, just so we understand, I try to tell people that at some level housing is not that complicated. You need capital money to build the housing and maintain it, and you need rental assistance of some kind in order to help people afford it if they're low income. The USDA 515 program is a 50-year 1% mortgage, which is great. They're everywhere. 87% of U.S. counties have a 515 project, and our data shows that in many of those places, it is the only or a significant portion of the affordable multifamily housing in that community. If we can go to the next slide. As Shannon mentioned, it turns out that 50 years is a long time, but it's not forever. And this is a tidal wave of the maturing mortgages that are coming over the next 35 years. And I don't have a slide on this, but even worse than the estimate that Shannon mentioned, USDA estimates that it's going to take $31 billion over the next 30 years to maintain this housing. So it's an enormous need. And if we can just go to the next slide, just mention that we've lost almost 22,000 units, as Shannon mentioned, over the last 5-year period that we looked at. In addition to maturing mortgages, owners have the right to prepay their mortgages in certain circumstances, and where markets change and owners, many of whom are for-profit owners, often small owners, if they can do better in the private market and exit the program, they'll do that. And if I can go to the next slide. And here you can see that it has a disparate impact across states, but it has a huge impact across the country, these property exits. And the last thing I would just say is real quickly, about 90% of these units receive what's called 521 rental assistance, which makes it affordable to the lowest income tenants. 515 tenants overall, you're talking about an average household income of about $14,500. Not surprisingly, those receiving rental assistance are closer to $12,000. 2/3 elderly and disabled, as was mentioned earlier. That's the rural population. So this is a population that desperately needs their housing maintained.
Thank you, Jonathan, for those stats. That it is good to see the situation that we're in. And I'm actually going to turn back to Trudy. I think you had a comment, but then I also have a question for you.
Okay, it was just, talking about the CDBG. We were attempting to assist one of our local cities to do a revolving loan fund for local community members who were renting out to low-income people and needed to do some repairs on their home, and they weren't getting done because they were charging a low rent, right? So it doesn't give them a lot of income to repair their home. And we quickly found out that the complexities of using the money stopped people from doing it, right? Now, my organization uses CDBG funds to help us when we're doing renovations for when we purchase a new home. However, we have the internal capacity and the people who know how to use the money, and we've been doing it for 33 years, so it makes it easier. But for individual community members to access that CDBG funding, they really need an intermediary like a Rebuilding Together or someone like that who can help them access that funding. And if you don't have that in a rural community, then they're not going to be accessing the CDBG funds, which are awesome. They're one of the least restrictive, easiest funds to use.
You are speaking such truth. That is one of the advocacy efforts that the Coalition for Home Repair is trying to address. Honestly, I don't know if there is research out there, but there is not. That's a place that we really need to see across the country. How difficult is it? I know that in even very large government systems, the waiting list to actually receive assistance for home repair is ridiculous. And I think this is a trend. I'm trying to see, is there any government out there that has figured out how to get the money out the door in any type of reasonable way? And so even having a baseline understanding of what the complexity is will allow for us to advocate potentially for some changes to how CDBG is expected to be implemented and administered. Because there's something wrong. So there's something definitely wrong, and because folks need it, but they're not getting the funds. And this includes those that are older adults, like you said, that for a variety of reasons, really could benefit from just that intermediary stepping in and being an advocate, helping them while they're dealing with other things in their lives to get that roof fixed. So yes, the funds are there, but actually getting people to it is a continuing challenge. And I think if folks aren't using the money, then there's always the other side of the coin of someone saying, well, the money must not really be needed because it's not getting spent. So we have to make sure we combat that at the same time. So thank you very much for bringing that up, because yeah, people are like, oh, the money's there. Well, it's about how you actually get to those funds. And so now I have another question for you, Trudy. This may actually be a lie, what are some unique barriers to building and building affordably in rural areas? And what are some practical challenges in preserving or renovating properties in rural areas? So kind of starting with that first one, just the building piece, and then speaking to preserving and renovation.
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is that it's not affordable without public funding assistance, right? So there, I saw a question come up in the chat around, well, can the private market do this? Well, if the private market could do this and make some money, they'd be doing it, right? The challenge is that the complexity to access the funds, just the application process is so challenging that many rural communities don't have the internal capacity even to get their hands on the money. And then if they do that, if they hire a grant writer and they apply to their local housing trust fund and they do all these things, when you actually are allocated the money, using it is so complex. Right? So I think that that is a huge barrier for smaller communities who may not have all of these amazing organizations out there who can help them, can be the intermediary, and they're just stuck. They don't know what to do. And I know, our local counties are saying, hey, we don't want to become housing developers. That's not what our job is as a county or a city. We need a partner to do that, but then there's no partners in the community that can do it. And unfortunately, I believe the system is broken. And to access funding and then use the funding, and the tendency is to blame the community for not accessing the money, right? Rather than saying, hey, we've set up a system that is so complex and so many parts of it are broken that people can't access it. They say what you just said, Freyja, excuse me, which is, oh, well, you don't need the money. You must not need the money if you can't do that, right? Or, oh, you don't have the capacity. So if you don't have the capacity to fill in a grant application, then you don't have the money or the capacity to run housing, which is not true, right? We know that. Those things are not related. there's lots of organizations who could run housing. They just can't do the grant application. So that's super challenging. And I think that's the biggest thing, is actually acquiring the funds it takes and then managing those funds. That's why we're not seeing properties being built, right? That's why we're not seeing properties being acquired, is because the capacity to just acquire the money is a barrier in itself. And I know over the last 33 years in our community, it seems every year there is a new barrier put up by one level of government or another. The city says, we're just going to add one more thing. And then the county says, we're just going to add one more requirement. And then the state says it. And then the federal government says it. And before you know it, when it used to be pretty easy to go out and buy a house and rehab it and move people in, it is now, we have a layer like this of barriers to the organizations who want to do the good work. We want to do the good work. We've been doing it for 33 or 50 years, right? And now we can't do it anymore. Or it takes us 3 times as long and 4 times as much money as it used to cost. Because suddenly all of these extra requirements, which I call barriers because that's what they are hoops that we have to jump through to do the work that the government and the community wants us to do. They tell us they want us to do it. And then they say, oh, but you got to do this, and but you got to do that, and but you get, right? And before you know it, you don't have the housing you need. And that's the sad part of it. This is not just, it didn't happen in the last 5 years, right? This is 30 years of a lot of policy making that has put barriers up to doing affordable housing.
Yeah, and actually the follow-up question for all of you is around what are the policy changes that you would recommend to make this more effective? I think you kind of touched on it a bit. And definitely, like you said, this wasn't something that just happened recently. A lot of those barriers are, be quite honest, are based on people's assumptions of what either they think they're helping to limit fraud, or they think certain rural communities, well, there's not that many people out there. So, there's all these like built-in assumptions that are systemic, that actually on the surface seem benign. They seem as if they're being utilized as safeguards, or this is just how proper business should be done. But in actuality, there's an undergirth of inequity intentionally put into place to limit access to certain communities, rural communities that are not seen, or sometimes are seen as valuable, but not for the people who already live there. They're seen as valuable for someone else who wants that land. There's a lot of things that we don't talk about as readily that affect how these policies come into play. And so I would love to know from all of you what your thoughts are. If you had, your chance to make that, take your once and the magic thing that if you had these changes in policy could turn the table, what would that be? So I'll turn to Shannon.
Sure. So, I mean, if money were no object, I mean, for sure, just as Jonathan had talked about earlier, being able to expand the authorities of USDA to preserve multifamily rental housing by restructuring existing Section 515 loans, if we were able to extend incentives for owners to stay in the program, if we were able to provide properties with additional resources to repair and restore homes, and ensuring that residents have rental assistance. I think also in our work with USDA, we're looking at, are there some creative ways to leverage some of the USDA rural development programming to reduce homelessness? So that's something that we're working on right now. And I think, additionally, something that I try to do is, because more money is not always in the cards, trying to think about, are there things that we could be doing? And in my case, to reduce homelessness in rural areas that are improvements to the system that aren't necessarily additional costs. And so I think a couple of those things are, number one, the data around affordable housing is often very divorced from the data on homelessness for some reason. And so I think, one of the things that could be done a lot better is getting a better sense and having good data on who's experiencing homelessness in rural areas and why, and matching that better with the housing supply data that we have, because you need that not only to make the case to federal policymakers and appropriators, but also even at a local level to be able to have good, effective allocation of the funding that you do have to the programs that are working the best to reduce homelessness and keep people in affordable housing. So I would say that regardless of the funding landscape, I think there's a lot of work that we could do on the data side that would really help paint the picture and, target our efforts more effectively.
Yeah, and if I can just build on that, I agree 100% with everything Shannon just said. I'm going to start really big here because something that Trudy said earlier really struck me, and I want to acknowledge that we're here, presenting for Up for Growth, which it really stands for the idea that it's not inexorable that housing costs should always go up. I do recommend that folks read two articles in the Atlantic, one called Housing Breaks People's Brains and the other called the Homeownership Society was a mistake. I don't subscribe to that statement, but they both go to the central challenge, which is that to the extent that there are folks who have a strong interest in scarcity of housing, including existing homeowners. And that's, I see every webinar I've ever been on always has a NIMBY question, and there's probably 5 in here. That is a rational response to want to, how many politicians can run on a platform of we need property values to go down, but if land becomes less valuable, if you can, that's how you get more affordable housing. That's a major challenge that we face. That's at the heart of this. That being said, I think it is also incredible the work that has been done in this area, because to Shannon's point, that heat map that I showed you earlier, that reflects that's strong data on the failure of our housing supply system. And if I showed you that and said, look at that, and now I'm going to tell you that our homelessness point in time count shows since 2009 a 10% reduction in overall homelessness, you would say, wow, that's a pretty amazing system. That system has really gotten way better at addressing homelessness in the face of this huge affordable housing stock problem. But instead, we're getting a little bit of fray of what you're saying, which is, why haven't you fixed this? There must be something wrong with you and the system. And in fact, that's not the case. So what we need to do are make the existing system work better through all of the different things that Shannon mentioned. But I think it's also really important to make the point that we can't do it without additional public resources. The fact that we have had an insignificant number of new housing choice vouchers relative to the overall need over the last decade is really problematic. And HAC was certainly supportive of the Build Back Better $151 billion in additional housing resources that didn't happen. So I just think it is important to say that we can make these policy improvements, but we do need more resources.
Thank you. Yes, more money is never going to be a bad thing. So yes, for sure. I'd like to turn back to Shannon in regards to a focus on the homelessness, the differences between rural homelessness and urban, and what are some of the differing challenges in both of these settings?
Sure. I mean, advocates and researchers sometimes refer to people who experience homelessness in rural areas as the hidden homeless, because it looks different than what we often think of, which in our minds, it's more typically in an urban context. Many people experiencing homelessness in rural areas live in places we don't see. They could be sleeping in the woods, in campgrounds, in cars, farm buildings or other places not intended for habitation. And also a lot of individuals and families in rural areas live in either substandard housing or are doubled up. So that makes even defining homelessness in rural areas difficult, and it makes it very difficult to get a clear picture of the scale of the problem. And I mean, in terms of raw numbers, for sure, there are more people in urban areas who are experiencing homelessness. But just to talk about trends for a second, in the US, the number of people overall experiencing homelessness rose by less than 1% from 2020 to 2022. But in rural areas, it was almost 6%. And so when we're talking about trend lines, the proportion increase kind of in rural areas is really alarming. I would say in terms of the similarities and differences, the same structural factors that contribute to urban homelessness, lack of affordable housing, inadequate income, systemic racism, also lead to rural homelessness. The things that can be a little bit different is that because counting rural homelessness is very difficult, it can exacerbate issues around the fact that federal priorities and programs tend to be awarded in criteria that favor urban areas with higher populations. And so the undercounting of homelessness in rural areas can further disadvantage those communities from getting resources to combat homelessness. The other area that I think is different and worth noting is that because in rural communities, they may lack the necessary infrastructure to meet the needs of people experiencing homelessness. For example, compared to urban areas, rural communities have fewer specialized services, shelters, trained staff, and there's a greater distance between services causing transport issues. So because of that, an additional burden on people experiencing homelessness in rural areas is often that they need to move to larger towns where they can access services, but where they now don't necessarily have a support system or social capital, which then just is further compounding the issue. So I would say those are some of the issues that are, particular to people experiencing homelessness in rural areas that are a bit different in a denser urban area.
Yes, Trudy.
Just adding on to that, you were talking about the people side of it, Shannon, and the actual production side of it. We experience a similar thing, right? Where we are building accessory dwelling units on the back of properties that we already own. And these are going to be dwelling units for adults with developmental disabilities who don't need to live in the group home that's already on the property. These builds are treated exactly the same, all the same requirements, all the same paperwork as a build of 100 units in downtown Seattle, right? Even though we've owned the property for 20 years, we received the funding in January of 2022 and we still haven't broken ground. It's going to cost us almost $500,000 per unit, per 600 square foot ADU unit. And most of that is coming from all of these requirements. For example, and this is unpopular, and I know it's unpopular, prevailing wage, right? And everybody's like, when you talk about prevailing wage and Davis-Bacon, it's like, oh, you don't want to pay your workers a fair wage. It's like, no, that's not the problem. The problem is in our rural community, there is one contractor who is able to work with prevailing wage, the administrative side of prevailing wage, right? So all our mom and pop contractors who are out there who would love to come and help us build a home can't do it. They can't do it because they can't handle the administrative burden. So not only is it jacking up our prices, but it's also cutting out all our local community builders and contractors and electricians because they don't have the capacity to do that. So being treated like we're urban when we're actually rural is super difficult and jacks the prices way up.
Yeah, thank you very much for that example, because that's something I think people don't know about. They just assume, I don't know what people assume, but yes, it's the same standards across, and that a lot of that is just the bureaucracy likes for things to be standardized, and in trying to have things to be adjustable or adaptable is not something government typically does. I actually, that kind of leads me to a couple of the questions that were in the chat box. One of them was regarding the counting of homelessness in rural settings. So in theory, I think Rose mentions that HUD regulations make provisions for doubled up people to be fined as homeless for the purpose of ESG and COC funding. But in practice, how well does this really work? And so just speaking to that, I think like you were kind of saying, finding people is harder in a rural setting versus finding people when you do, that count in an urban setting. So, but what has been your experience?
Yeah, I would say this is one of the reasons why, for actually looking at, are we reducing homelessness? Are our programs effective? We really think it's necessary to have more granular, frequent data than what's available in the point in time count. I think that the point in time count definitely is, serves a purpose, and it's a census of what's going on, but you're talking about a group of volunteers a night or two in January who are going around and trying to count who they can in an area that's spread out. They're not obviously going to be knocking on people's doors to ask if they're doubled up. And so I think even if definitionally a certain group can, technically be counted as homeless, in reality, because we're so reliant on the point in time count and not reliant on the day-to-day information systems where workers are having contact with different individuals, we then end up not counting the people that are less visible, during the point in time count process.
If I could just, I'm going to add to that. I would say, first of all, without a doubt, the point in time count was a huge improvement compared to the data that was available prior to it, but it is not good enough now for us to help address homelessness. But to go to an underlying piece of it, which is also eligibility for funding, I happen to have been involved in the crafting of the of the current continuum of care, and the intention from the beginning was to provide more flexibility in rural areas in recognition of the fact that homelessness looks different, and to provide more flexibility around serving folks who were doubled up. This is a controversial issue, the definition of homelessness and eligibility for HUD funding, but I think it's important to know that from the beginning, the idea was to provide more flexibility in rural areas and recognize capacity issues. It has been a challenge to implement that for various, inside the Beltway reasons that aren't worth getting into. But I do want to point out that the recent rural homelessness NOFO was specifically targeted to help address that, and I think represents the fruition of the original vision of recognizing that rural communities are different and have capacity challenges that urban ones do not.
100%. Thanks for bringing that up, Jonathan. Yeah.
Yep, that's a really good point. Another question is in regards, or statement, in regards to local housing trust funds. So in this, it was mentioned that they have some flexibility, that it's not as much of a burden for them to access it, but a lot of communities don't have local housing trust funds. So that is a nice thing that you do have that, honestly, but there's so many places that's not even that's a magical wish. But those types of dollars do allow for more flexibility, and it is wonderful. And I wish more states and local governments did take some type of approach to that. And I know a lot of states, particularly the homelessness advocates, are really trying to have more local housing trust fund dollars available, but it's just not something that all states are buying into. But I was wondering if any of you had experiences with housing trust funds. Yes, Trudy.
Yeah, so we're really lucky. We have a very strong housing trust fund in Washington State, and it's in the upcoming legislative session just finished, and it's being funded again at a fairly high level. I think the challenges that we with our trust fund, at least, is that it gets very again bureaucratic and complex, right? And very much dialed into, we want you to serve this group of people at this income level, and it can only be in this kind of housing, right? And it's all this list. And so they narrow it down and narrow it down. And before you know it, there's only this little group of people who are getting to be served, or the organizations who can serve them are not in rural communities, right? And so then what happens is communities do appropriations, right? They go to their local representative and say, hey, we need $200,000 or we need $2 million so we can do this project because we don't have the capacity to apply to the trust fund. Would you acquire that for us? And then that money comes out of the trust fund, and it's not part of the big money that's distributed throughout the state. And I know that for the trust fund, this is very problematic, right? To have these set asides, but it's the only way that rural communities can access the money, right? So they've set up a system that doesn't work for rural communities by making the requirements very narrow. Like, these are the only people you can serve. We're going to give you the most points if you serve these 10 people, or we're going to get it or whatever. And so it just makes it super challenging. And even though we're super fortunate that we have a housing trust fund, actually getting the funding and then spending the funding, a lot of barriers. So that's not great for small communities.
Yeah, if I could just add a couple really important things here. First of all, anytime you add a bureaucratic barrier, you disproportionately impact rural communities. That's just, I want to say that that's a given. But I think the second important point is housing trust funds are critical, but housing trust funds do not allow you to serve folks by and large below 50% of area median income, maybe a little bit lower. You have to have ongoing rental assistance. And I think that is, I have been in a number of rural communities in this country where, state officials say we can't spend our trust fund dollars here because there's no public housing authority with the capacity to take vouchers and project-base them, which I know is something that Trudy has been very successful with. But like, if you look at, I think you worked with the Olympia or Thurston County Housing Authority in rural areas, they have a 2,000 voucher program. That's large. Like, for rural areas, that's huge. So you have many rural areas where the trust fund dollars may be able to go, but if they don't come coupled with a voucher or 521 rental assistance or something that makes it deeply affordable, it doesn't work.
Actually, that's one of the questions in our chat. It's in particular, I'm thinking of housing authorities that don't have voucher programs and only have public housing. Often these PHAs are facing challenges with maintaining housing to be safe and healthy, but also have some of the only deeply affordable housing in the rural area. What role can they play? Is there, like, what they need? Sounds like they also need help in terms of just the maintenance of their own facilities, but that is the primary source of affordable housing. Any solutions, ideas?
I would say that I mean, this is a larger structural issue around housing authorities and how can we encourage regional collaboration. But I think the other thing, I feel like we've done a little bit of the deficit-based issues approach here. I think one of the great things in rural communities, my experience, is the collaborative mentality is huge. And also, everybody knows the individual projects that we're talking about in a community. So I would say, the thing for that PHA to do is talk to the other folks in the community about, that public housing project is just like a 515 project. It's all part of the same affordable housing stock that desperately needs to be maintained. And that the world we live in now is it's a mixed finance approach to sustaining housing. So be part of that conversation.
Yeah. And I put in chat, our local housing authority of Thurston County, they are hugely successful. They do have a huge voucher program, but they also self-finance and bond their own building projects. So they have lots of public housing. It's beautiful public housing, but they haven't bought in to the LIHTC program, which for lots of folks, it's a challenging program to be in, right? When you have an investor who comes in and then takes money out of the community and then you're left to maintain the housing, well, you don't have enough income because it's low income. But our housing authority, I think we're super fortunate, has taken a different approach and being super successful at it. building their own properties, running their own properties, and then also doing vouchers. And so, and in doing their vouchers, doing project-based vouchers, they're not just vouchering their own housing, they're vouchering other housing in the community. So we have 17 properties that have project-based vouchers that make it affordable for us to maintain this low-income housing. So, you know, I highly recommend the Housing Authority of Thurston County. Check them out. They've got a great program and smart people running it.
Wonderful. I'm a little checking, just doing a little check time. I'm going to look at one more question here. With displacement from rural areas to more urban areas to access services, do you have any thoughts on how to quantify displacement from community due to homelessness versus just accounting for the number of homeless people in the community?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back, you know, to what I was saying before about the information system needing to transition from just being a contract management or a grant management system to actually a people-centric system that can track, you know, what's going on with each individual person and whether or not they've been housed. Right now, the way the information system works for homelessness is it's project-based. So if you start receiving services in a specific federally funded program, that gets logged into the system because that program needs to report to HUD or to whatever agency on how many services are being provided. But it doesn't very easily help the people on the ground really map what's happening with people. And the data, in large part, is actually there. It's just configured in a way that it's really hard to do that. And so what we have found in the communities that we work in that's really important is to have, you know, a currently active list, a by name list of everyone experiencing homelessness that's updated, you know, at least on a monthly basis so that you can track at that point when people have left the community, when people are coming into the community from somewhere else. Because that's, like you said, not something you're going to get from a point in time count. And it's also not something that you're going to get from, you know, a grant compliance based information system. But I will say that HUD is working on that. And so really kind of excited to see where that goes. But we're hoping to help make sure that that data is available in more communities.
I know we need to wind up, but I just want to make I just want to make the point. I agree 100% with that. And I would just also add that it is generally important to Trudy's point about the LIHTC program, that a lot of these challenges, they just arise from the fact that our policies and resources, they're not designed for rural communities. You know, the business model for LIHTC is a 50-unit building in an urban area. And so there's so many, you know, so many programs that are not designed for rural. And by the way, rural has much less access per capita to philanthropic dollars, to other things. So they have less resources to take the square peg and put it into their round hole. So I just wanted to, you know, make that larger point. That it's not a tweaking. This is a major change in the way we think. You know, the way I put it is rural America is not a supporting actor in the story of the United States.